About Japan, first point I want to make here is that Japan has a temperate climate. Now, folk, I've discussed it with some people. I don't know why it is, but persons who live down here in the tropics, tropical climate, generally are not as industrious or do not advance as high or not as inventive or creative as persons who live here in a tropical climate, meaning in a moderate temperate climate. Maybe it's because with this part of the world, there's no winter coming. I mean, in a temperate climate, you have a small window of opportunity you can plant. Like, for instance, here in North Georgia, most crops have to be planted between April 15th and May 15th. It's just a small window of opportunity. And my sister told about Ohio farmers who were really in real quandary one year. It kept raining and raining and raining during planting season. If I wondered, when are we going to be able to plant? Because you can't plow a muddy garden. It's wet, even with the best tractors. Finally, the mud dried up enough for them to plow, but they all had to get out on Sunday and plow away on Sunday because it was the only time that they had dry because a big rainstorm they knew was forecast for Monday. But they finally got their garden plowed up. Then when it came time to plant, they had to do the same thing, similar. Plant really fast on Sunday because Sunday was a dry day and the rain was coming on Monday. You have a small opportunity to plant, and then come harvest time, a small window of opportunity to harvest if you don't get the crops in time. So anyway, people in a temperate climate have a schedule they must keep. People in the tropics can plant anytime they want to, and for the most part harvest anytime they want to, and it just simply doesn't make that much of a difference. All right. Another thing about Japan also, it's located along a fault line. Now here's the thing about a fault line. Let's say that, nobody can see. If the Earth sits on tectonic plates, and in the area where the tectonic plates come together, this is called a fault line. Now, if the one tectonic plate moves a little bit, and if you're in the middle of the movement, you're not going to feel much of a tremor. But if you're on a fault line, and the fault line moves, the people living on the fault line are going to feel a tremendous shock. In the case of the Japanese, they have an earthquake about every few years. The last one, I believe, occurred in 2011, 4 years ago. And it was a big earthquake that set off a huge tidal wave. And a tidal wave sent salt water, ocean water, over the land. And the ocean water got inside a nuclear reactor and contaminated some of the water. And the water that was contaminated went over some of the land and contaminated some of the land that cattle used to graze. And you cannot graze cattle on that land anymore for a while. It won't be with you for a long time. There was some of the area is radioactive. The Japanese, being the resilient, industrious people that they are able to clean up the mess and restore things as much as is possible. But they do have a problem with earthquakes and have had all the way down through their history. Now, these three countries we're talking about, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, all were influenced by China, which they called the Middle Kingdom. All three of them gave civil service exams at one point or another. Now, Japan is a group of islands off from a big continent, and it has been compared with Great Britain. You may know that Great Britain is a couple of islands off the coast of Europe. And in the case of both Great Britain and Japan, they are influenced by the mainland they live near, but nevertheless, they've been free enough to be independent. Now, unlike Japan, Great Britain was conquered two times, conquered by Canute the Great, and then conquered William the Conqueror. We'll not mention Canute. The British people know about him, but his name's not in our history book. But William the Conqueror is. But anyway, as for Japan, Japan never lost a war until 1945 when the United States defeated them. Now, about these three countries, they all have something else in common. Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, they all three fought a war against the United States. and take it in sequence. We fought the war against Japan first, on the side of one of the Koreas next, and on the side of one of the Vietnams last. And our progression, folks, was a downhill progression. We defeated Japan. It's over. They're whipped. Went to Korea. We fought to a stalemate in Korea. Went to Vietnam, and we lost. Win, stalemate, lose. And I wonder if that wasn't to set the tone for our next wars, because the wars we're fighting now just go on and on and on and on and on and on and on, with nobody winning, nobody losing. That's another topic, though. All right. Japan consists of 4 islands. Now, folks, I want to give you a few hints about like taking a multiple choice test. If you were asked on a multiple choice test, Japan consists of 4 islands. They are, and one of the choices is Okinawa. What do you do? Pick one. Somebody would know if it's one. Pick another choice. Okinawa is not the right answer. Pick another choice. So if one of the choices is Taiwan, Formosa, I think. Go to another choice. Sometimes even if you don't know, if you just simply know a little bit, you can eliminate 1 and 2 answers and have a much better, every answer you can eliminate gives you a better chance of getting it right. All right. Now, in the case of Japan, Japanese islands, most of the people live along the East Coast. Because the East Coast has good harbors, the West Coast has more beach land and flat land. The East Coast also is warmer because the warm waters from the Pacific Ocean keep the place warmer. But these harbors make it easy for ships to come in and find shelter from rough seas. It's hard to find shelter on a beach land. So the Japanese traders would trade, of course, always trade with the West. I mean, in the time period we're talking about. I mean, if you look on a map and see all this broken up eastern side of Japan, and it's somewhat more smooth. There's a fairly good harbor right here, but much more smooth western side. So these people would get on their ships and go around the islands to go to China or Taiwan or the Philippines or even Korea, and didn't spend a whole lot of time on the eastern side. I mean, on the western side. Most of the people live on the eastern side, not the western. Now, Japan's soil is composed of volcanic ash because the land of Japan, being on a fault line, sometime in its history, there was a lot of volcanic activity and it spewed up a whole lot of volcanic ash. And volcanic ash is known to be very rich, so their soil is rich. However, only a small part of the land is farmable, owing to the fact that the volcanoes left some really ragged mountains. And the thing about tall mountains, oftentimes the sun only shines on one side of them, and only that for a few hours a day. Whereas in the valleys between the mountains, the sun might almost never shine. So it's difficult to farm owing to the rugged mountains. So only a small percentage of their land can be farmed. Now, Japanese history. Well, before we get to that, I want to say one more thing about Japan. Japan is the only country in the world that has had the same dynasty having the title of emperor for, I've heard, as long as 2,600 years. And it's quite a long time. So their emperor is looked on as being divine. As far as I know, no one in Japan has ever even thought of assassinating an emperor. But the other problem that the emperor has, so unlike the Chinese emperors, the Japanese emperors have mostly been nothing more than mere figureheads. They have the office. They're looked on as being divine. They live in isolation from their people. And the Japanese count time from the emperor. Now, the present Japanese emperor took office around 1989, which means this is about the year 26 of the present emperor. Again, this is the way they count time. The last emperor governed for something close to 45 or 50 years. The last emperor, the father of this one, took office when he was young and was in power throughout the entire World War II. In fact, the Japanese so much prized the office of emperor that one of the reasons they were slow at surrendering was the United States demanded an unconditional surrender, and they said, well, will you just make us one concession, one promise? You promise that you will allow us to keep our emperor. The United States said, we're not going to promise you anything. So the United States proceeded to drop one bomb. The Japanese would not surrender. They dropped a second bomb, and this time the Japanese did surrender. Then the United States left the office of emperor intact. But MacArthur set up his headquarters in Tokyo, and instead of MacArthur going to visit the emperor did something unthinkable. The emperor came and visited MacArthur in his office, showing the Japanese. And MacArthur told the emperor, you must renounce your title of divinity. The emperor did so, even though some Japanese still believe that he's divine. Very few of them, though. Now, having said that, that's important to understand what was going on. The start of Japanese history starts with the Jomon. It is suspected that the Jomon came from China, but again, we're not sure of that. And they came from China and may have been some of China's outcasts, and developed. They started off as being just food gatherers and fishers, living off of fish and berries and whatever they could find. However, today some people believe that they had mastered the art of agriculture and they were into cattle raising and food growing. The Jomon eventually gave way to the Yayoi. I'm not sure about how this is pronounced, but the Yayoi. Most Japanese today know that they're descended from these people. Now, the Japanese initially organized themselves into small chieftains, small tribes headed by a chieftain. But inevitably, one of the chiefs claimed that he was superior. He set himself up. Your book names him. I'm going to ask you to learn his name. And every Japanese emperor from that day till this claims that he's descended from the original chieftain. The Japanese creation myth says that they started out as a result of a union between a god and a goddess, and their children was the universe, so their child was the universe. Now, a lot of primitive people believe this, but the difference is with Japan is this is the only country in the world where this somewhat primitive type of creation myth has persisted all the way up to the present time. Now, the Japanese emperors then claimed that he was a god because he was descended from the gods. And this was believed by the Japanese for at least possibly around 2,000 years. Now, I want to say this, when you compare Japan to Great Britain. Queen Elizabeth II, I've once had a chart in my house about her line of descent. Somehow or another that chart got lost. But she's descended from a king named Cerdic who lived around 1,600 years ago, around 400. It would have been about the time of King Arthur, if King Arthur existed at all, about the time of King Clovis. And then, if you believe the mythologies, Cerdic could trace his ancestry all the way back to Adam through Noah. A lot of European kings tried to trace their ancestry all the way back to Adam. But again, they were trying to prove, this was true of the kings of all over, that They were a special race of people who were destined from the beginning to rule over others. Now, not that I in any way believe that or agree with it, but they believed it. And except for Oliver Cromwell, all the kings of England have been descended from Cerdic. All of them since 1100 have been descended, and all of them since 1000 have been descended from William the Conqueror. In the case of the Japanese, they've all been descended from the Japanese emperor who initially put himself above the other chieftains and said, "I'm in charge." Now, here is the thing about Japanese history. It is like a pendulum that goes back and forth. At times they had a strong central government, not necessarily headed up by the emperor, but often by prime minister. At times they were strong and centralized. Then they would get tired of the central government, rebel against the central government, and the nobles would take over. So at times it was a weak central government and strong nobility. Well, when the nobles took over, the Japanese nobles would start fighting among themselves and fighting each other. When the people got tired of that, they demanded the central government become strong again, and somebody in the central government would rise up and strengthen the central government, put down the rebellious nobles, and Japan would be all centralized again. But they would go back and forth from centralization to fragmentation, and back from fragmentation to centralization. Eventually the Japanese learned to grow rice. They got in a few cattle. Even though Japan has a difficult time with its cattle market, again owing to the fact that cattle cannot be grazed on very, very steep land that is so steep that it cannot grow grass. Now, Japan also was threatened by conquest from time to time by China. The Chinese when they were strong, the Chinese would conquer Korea and conquered Vietnam. And when the Chinese conquered Vietnam, they would go in to try to conquer Japan. So this was one of the things that kept the Japanese together, knowing that, hey, if we start fighting among ourselves like the Koreans do, we'll be conquered by the Chinese. The most serious attempt by China to conquer Japan was made by Kublai Khan, who sent a very large fleet, and had the fleet actually arrived in Japan, it might have succeeded in conquering Japan. Japan did not have a navy or army big enough to handle it, but a wind came up called a kamikaze and destroyed the Chinese fleet. Now, eventually, Japan only has about 10 or 12% of its land that can be farmed. When this farmland became taken over by the wealthy, the Japanese took over, the strong central government took over and said all farmland belongs to the state. So nobody had any private ownership of the farms. The state got all the farmland, and that meant that taxes were paid to the state because the state owned the land, of course. And so when the harvest was made, the best of the crop went to the state, and what was left went to the people. And this worked the same way it has worked everywhere where it's been tried. It brought down the Japanese government. And Japan then went back to being fragmented for a while. And then the farmland eventually went back to being held by a few rich. Now, folk, I want to clarify. I got to thinking about something. I made a speech the other class about helping the poor. For you as individuals, or for me as individuals, to help the poor is a virtue. It's noble. When you ask the government to help the poor, the result is the government crumbles, crashes down. Helping the poor is never supposed to be a function of the state. When you give land or give anything to the poor, I mean, okay, in the case of Russia, in 1862, the Russian Tsar freed all the serfs. But he told the serfs, the nobles are to give you land, but you're to spend 50 years paying for it. That worked better than a lot of other systems because at least the serfs had to pay every year as some of their income to the noble. It's like we do. We buy land and we buy a piece of property and take out a 30-year loan on it. We're obligated to pay the loan for 30 years or so, 20 years if you take a 20-year loan, 15-year loan if you want to do that. You may already know that the cheapest way is to take a 15-year loan. You find out spending less in the long run. But some experts say, no, take a 30-year loan and invest the extra money that you'd spend if you were taking a 15-year loan. Do the math yourself. But anyway, people who have to pay for the land that they live on or buy it have a better chance of keeping it than people who are given land by the government say, hey, we're such nice government. Here's your deed to a title of land. Go build a house on it and farm it. Within a generation, most of them have lost it. This has happened time and time and time again throughout history. In a few minutes, how the Koreans tried this and then lost. Robbing the rich to feed the poor only makes the poor dependent. And the poor wind up feeling like, hey, we're entitled to it. Then the poor become unproductive, and the result is everybody topples. Now, anyway, Japan had a tradition of centralization that, I mean, of course, the times of centralization would break down, but this may be one of the main reasons why that Japan sided with Italy and Germany in World War II. Italy was a fascist country. Germany, also a highly super centralized country. And that just fit right well with the Japanese ideology because they believed in strong centralization also, so the three of them joined together. And they lost to the democracies, Great Britain and the United States. Actually, I'll tell you something, they might have won had not Hitler turned on the Soviet Union, which was just as autocratic as Hitler was, but sometimes people who are alike hate each other worse than hate people who are different. But if Hitler would have left the Soviet Union alone, he might very well have defeated Great Britain and then become so powerful the United States could not handle it. So, yeah, it was a loss for the autocracies and a triumph for the democracies, at least temporarily. Now, about religion. The Japanese religion is called Shinto. Now, you're going to have a hard time if you, I had a niece who was, when she was in college, knew I was a history teacher and asked me, what do I know about Shintoism? Because she was assigned to write about it. I said, well, okay, very little. The Japanese people are the least loyal to their religion of about any people on the face of the earth. Much more indifferent, especially since the emperor was said to not be divine. But Shintoism called for worshiping the emperor as divine, among other things. It also said that the emperor was incapable of making a mistake, and this was true of all the government. The government could never be wrong because the government, after all, was holy. So the government was to be obeyed without question. It also prized what they called the tea ceremony. And again, it reminds you of Great Britain. Great Britain, they liked the tea drinking. The Japanese made religious ceremony out of it. It calls for a lot of rituals that are usually performed, in fact, the Shintoism now. It calls for a lot of rituals usually performed before a shrine. Also, Shinto likes to beautify the area around it. So, devout Japanese Shinto people will plant flowers around their house or put flowers in their yard to make their yard very beautiful. You'll see pictures of them time to time, and sometimes even put flowers on the roof of their house or let flowers grow on the side of the house, all in an attempt because they believe that this is the way the spirit world wants them to be. However, into this scenario, Buddhism came, but Buddhism was not welcomed in Japan. Again, like the Chinese, perhaps even more than Chinese, the Japanese did not appreciate any religion that they had not put together themselves. So Buddhism didn't get far in Japan. Now it did, we're talking about it did in Korea and it did in Vietnam. Japan, no. Like China, the Japanese copied China's civil service exam. Now, folks, this statement I'm about to make does not apply to everywhere in Japan or all times in Japan. Sometimes this practice varies from place to place and time to time, but only the nobles could take the exam, which guaranteed that the nobles would have the power and keep the power within their family. Now, if a nobleman had 6 sons and saw that his first one, maybe his second one, was totally incapable of governing, he might use the exam as an excuse to bypass his older sons and give his title of nobility to a younger son. So the exam did benefit some people and gave offices to people who otherwise might not have gotten them. Also, the central government would sometimes see that a certain person was bypassed in favor of someone who was not first in line for the office. Now, your book then talks about the shoguns, shogunate system. I'm not going to ask you to learn that. One thing, though, that no, don't worry about the shoguns right now. The shogun, though, guaranteed that the emperor would rule in name only and have almost no real authority. Instead, the shoguns would fight for authority among themselves, and they were set up in part to help to make sure that China never conquered them. Now, there was another thing that affected Japan greatly, and folk, we just in the modern world can hardly appreciate this, but smallpox has been a real problem all over the globe. It may have started out in Africa, but I'm not sure if we know where it started. But at some point it spread into the Far East, and then it wound up spreading into Japan, and it wiped out a big part of the Japanese population. Plagues, no, mankind is not to do with plagues. We had a real problem with plague just less than a year ago, the Ebola plague, but today we can handle it a little better. And the last time I heard, the Ebola plague has been largely contained thanks to efforts of isolation. All right, last September I had a pupil who was supposed to come here from Ebola country, and I was wondering, how am I going to handle it? Our country not living in. So I don't know what kind of snag, but she emailed me a couple of times wanting to know about how to get a book. And she told me, well, I've been delayed because of Ebola. The next thing I knew, she'd either dropped or been dropped out of school. I don't know the details. Anyway, we still have plagues, but we can handle them better than we once did. In those days, all they could do was simply let the plagues burn themselves out. And by the way, I'll repeat what I've said. Plagues seem to hit us in times of climate cooling and then go away in times of climate warming. Oh yeah, there were the samurai, and this I do want. From time to time you'll see this. In fact, I trade sometimes in options, and I have traded futures, and they run into that term even in futures and option trade, but never mind that. Basically, the samurai were like the European knights. European knights were mounted warriors who fought from horseback, but whereas European knights fought with spears and swords, the samurai fought with bows and arrows. And when I say bow down, I don't mean that they had their horse stand real still and then I'll take aim. They would shoot their arrows while the horse was going at half gallop, or in some cases full gallop. And this folk took years and years of practice, but they got to where they could hit a target fairly consistently with their horse running at full gallop in mounted position. But these were the Japanese warriors, and they did a lot to keep the Chinese at bay. Again, really highly trained, highly skilled warriors of noble birth, just like European knights had to be of noble birth also. I mean, only a nobility could afford the armor that was necessary. Anyway, they began to help determine who was in charge of Japan and who wasn't. Your book shows a picture of a samurai warrior on page 309. These, like the Japanese, like the Chinese, the Japanese eventually, for a while, developed a system called a feudal system. Now, the word feudal, we're going to run into that word when we come to chapter 12. It was done a little bit in India and then done a little bit in Japan, but it really had its most prominent feature in Europe. The word feudal basically means that you have a king, but he's very weak and ineffective. The real power lies in the hands of each individual nobles, and the nobles will swear loyalty to the king, but they're really not always that loyal. And the nobles wind up fighting among themselves, but it's a loose confederation of a bunch of nobles who claim that they're united and claim that they're one. We'll run into this when we come to Europe, because Europe in the Middle Ages was become a feudal system, with a king at the top, and under the king were the various dukes, and under the dukes were the counts, and under the counts the barons, the reeds, the earls, and whatever other rank of nobility you might have in your country. Feudal system, again, where there is a king, but he has very little authority, and the authority rests in the hands of the nobles who much too often fight among themselves. Now, about their social life, the social classes. One class you want to remember is at the bottom of the barrel was the Eta. The Eta can be compared to the untouchables of India. These were people who were permanently bound to almost slavery. In fact, in some ways, their lot might have been worse than slave. They were bound to perpetual poverty with no chance of bettering themselves. These are the people who did the dirtiest jobs. The street cleaners, the manure shovelers, the really, really low-down jobs that the rest of the people in Japan did not want to touch. They were looked down on as being something maybe a little bit more than an animal, but somewhat less than human. And I said this in the first class, I did this class also. I believe if you could have taken all the Japanese Eta and take them out of Japan and trained them in the arts of democracy and self-worth, they could have formed the greatest nation on earth. Why do I think so? Because the United States is made up of outcasts from mostly three continents. Europe's outcast, Asia's outcast, and Africa's outcast. But these poor outcasts together, and they made the greatest nation the world has ever seen. And I'm not the least bit embarrassed or ashamed to tell you that I'm descended from a penniless Scottish immigrant who came over here from the old world, up in Scotland, with nothing. And if you think, if you are also descended from a penniless American immigrant, that is nothing at all to be embarrassed about. Again, the untouchables, the Eta, I think if you got them together, their minds were just as good as anyone else's. They happen to have the misfortune of being maybe born into the wrong class or whatever. They could have amounted to something if they had been allowed to. Manufacturing, and one point your book makes, I want to look at page 310. Manufacturing developed better during a time when the central government was weak and the nobles were in power. Maybe that tells you something about what makes manufacturing great. Folks, that you need a central government. When the central government is in control, forget it. The less power in the central government, provided it's not too weak now, but provided it's still strong enough to collect taxes and keep some kind of domestic order. But otherwise, when the central government is weak, the people rise up and they fill in. And manufacturing did better in Japan when the central government was weak, and did worse when the central government was strong. Women, in the case of women in Japan, you cannot make a blanket statement. In some places in Japan, and then sometimes the women seem to have been almost equal to the men. They could own property, they could divorce their husbands. In other places in Japan, the women were considered inferior. And in some places they were not allowed to own property, were not allowed to divorce their husbands. And again, it varied from time to time and place to place. For the most part, though, they were not considered equal to men. Now, the one thing I want to say about Japan before we move on, I may have told you, I don't know a lot about the literature of these countries or about their artwork, but there's one bit of the literature that I do want to mention, because I ran into it when I was in high school, and my daughters ran into it when they were growing up. Haiku. Japanese linked verse is known as haiku. Now, how many of you have run into haiku poetry? And okay, about a third of the hands have gone up. One reason I remember it, folk, is when I was 15 years old in 10th grade, going to Madison High School just west of Middletown, Ohio, our teacher asked us all to make a haiku poem. Why do I remember it so well? I couldn't do it. Essentially, though, what I understand now, a haiku poem is a linked verse. I believe there's so many syllables in the first line, so many syllables in the second line, and then the third line. The first two lines seem to get your mind going one way, then the third line jerks you in another direction. Is that the impression you get of haiku also? Yeah, it is. It has an unexpected twist or turn on line 3. It's 3 lines, and each line consists of so many syllables. That much I know, but I forget the numbers. Does anybody remember the numbers?
5, 7, 5.
5, 7, and 5? Oh, thank you. 5 syllables on the first line, 7 on the second, 5 on the third. Again, I couldn't do it. Korea. In the case of the Koreans, folk, we don't know where they came from. And books, the older books that talked about the human races would sometimes put the Koreans in a race all by themselves, just them. They appear to not be Asiatic, and they appear to not be Indo-European. But then we used DNA and found out they're human beings the same way as the rest of us. So, so where they came from or how they got to Korea, even we don't know. Now, folks, this might liven up a little bit. Let me tell you before I start, I do not believe a word I'm about to say, but nevertheless. The Koreans claim that they came from another planet and came down from the heavens, which personally I doubt, especially since DNA proves that they are very much human. But they started out in a place called Korea. Now, I'm going to sum up their history in about a couple of sentences here. They have spent most of their history being disunited or ruled by foreigners. Very little of the time have they been united. Have they been both united and independent at all? It's been very rarely, or very little. And then fast forward to 2015, in the year 2015, they are disunited and strongly influenced by foreigners. But they're an independent country, but they are disunited still, and they have been for almost all of their history. Korea is more influenced by China than it is by Japan. It's like Japan, mountainous and very difficult to farm. Now, I want to say this about the farming. The best farmland in Korea is in North Korea. The worst farmland in Korea is in South Korea. Having said that, now I want to turn right around and say that the North Koreans are starving and the South Koreans are thriving. Well, didn't you just say that the worst of the farmland was in South Korea? Yes, but the South Koreans have learned to industrialize. I mean, they make automobiles, the Hyundai, the Kia, made in South Korea. A lot of people who own them say they're really good cars. That's a matter of opinion, but anyway, the North, they're starving in spite of having the best of the land. And guess what? They blame the United States for all their problems, which is a surefire way to guarantee that their problems will not be solved. Blame someone else, say the problem is not the United States, the problem is communism. Until they get rid of that, they're not going to go anywhere. And folks, if anyone of you wants to say anything contrary to what I'm saying, I mean, the floor is open. I'll try not to argue with you. Now, there's some topics I'll argue about, but this time, if you don't like what I'm saying against socialism and communism, you're welcome to let me know it. I might not say it, but I mean, hey, folks, it's just observed fact. Anyway, the Korea in a difficult land to farm. Now, it looks like, I mean, Korea is attached to China, but for most of what you call China proper, this populated part of China here, I mean, this part of China is not as populated as this part. From here, Japan is actually closer to Korea than China is. So the Japanese often have invaded Korea. The Chinese often have invaded Korea. But since China was bigger, Korea mostly fell into the hands of China. Now that was reversed in World War II. During World War II, Japan became a strong country. Japan went in and took over Korea, and they took over a big part of China, only to be driven out of China and eventually forced out of Korea. But they have a big influence, and they treated the Koreans very terribly. And to this day, their history books will not talk about how badly they mistreated the Koreans. And their government has never made anything that resembles an apology for the treatment of the Koreans. That's jumping ahead of the story a little bit. Because of the bad treatment of the Korea as we see from outsiders throughout their history, they eventually became known as the Hermit Kingdom, and they were called that even as recently as the 1950 and 52 Korean War, because they tried to isolate themselves from other people, owing to the fact that they were sandwiched between two powerful enemies, and oftentimes at the mercy of both. Now, at one point early in our history, Japan conquered the southern part of Korea. Then China got the northern part. Eventually, China got it all under the Han Dynasty. So during the Han Dynasty, Korea was considered part of China. Then, when the Han Dynasty fell, the Koreans rose up and drove the Chinese out of Korea and set up their own country, but they could not unite. Once they got independent from China, they wound up having three kingdoms. I'm not asking you to memorize them, but there were three kingdoms. And China had a lot of influence on both of them. About this time, while there were three kingdoms, Confucianism and Buddhism was introduced. Confucianism did not make a whole lot of headway into Korea, but Buddhism did. Somehow the Korean people, Buddhism had a lot more influence, and unlike Japan and unlike China, Buddhism wound up becoming the dominant religion of most of Korea, and has remained so until very recently. Now, I want to fast forward to 2015. It has been said that South Korea is the most Christian nation on the face of the earth. And on any Sunday, a higher percentage of South Koreans will be attending a Christian church than that will be attending a Christian church in any other country on earth. However, the South Koreans are still half Buddhist, the other half Christian. with the Christian and Buddhist supposedly work together in some kind of harmony. But unlike Japan, unlike China, Buddhism made inroads into South Korea that has stayed there till this day. And eventually Buddhism became the state religion of all of Korea's 3 states, and remained a state religion when those 3 states fell and other states came in and took their place. Now, like the Chinese and Japanese, and like the Vietnamese also, Korea set up the civil service exam, and it was an attempt to get control who would be in positions of government and who would not. And again, in the case of all these countries, Japan, China, Korea, and Vietnam, only men could take the exam. Now, here's where they made one of their biggest mistakes. One of the kingdoms was the Silla. Don't worry about the name. I promise you it will probably not be on a test, but one thing, though, that I want to emphasize. The Silla took the lands that the rich, they thought were too much land the rich had, and redistributed these lands among the poor. All of you think we've been paying attention, all know what I'm about to say next. It brought down the Silla government. Redistribution. Take land from the rich and divide it among the poor. Folk, if they could have just set up a banking system and told the poor people, hey, you can take out a 30-year loan, and in 30 years, maybe you and your children will have it all paid off, but take out a 30-year loan, and after 30 years, the land will be yours. It might have worked better. And only told the nobles, you don't have to sell it, but sell it only if you want to. If you want some steady income for 30 years, you can sell it. But giving the nobles a choice of either selling it or not, and giving the people the option to buy or not. But buy on a 30-year loan. I mean, it's what we're doing, and it seems to work pretty well. Instead, they outright gave the land to the poor as a gift. And it wound up bringing down the whole government. What's wrong with it? Again, the poor became dependents, expecting handouts, became less than productive, and the Silla government collapsed. When the government collapsed, civil war ensued. Out of the chaos emerged the Koryo, and this is one dynasty. Remember the Koryo dynasty, from where we get the name Korea. Now, there's only 2 countries I know of that are named after one of their ruling classes. In the case of Koreans, they're named after the Koryo dynasty that ruled them for a while. The other country is Saudi Arabia. For most of history, this was known as just Arabia. Then the Saudi family took over, and they renamed it Saudi Arabia after their family name. Here's on one side of Asia, Korea, named after Koryo. Now, by the way, the Koryo do not still rule Korea, but the name stuck. Anyway, the Koryo dynasty took over, and they gave their name to their country. The Koryo felt a need to set up a powerful army because of the pressure from the Mongolians. The Mongolians eventually took over anyway and put the Koreans to tributary and made a lot of the Koreans very poor. Finally, though, a Korean military commander overthrew the Koryo and drove out the Mongolians. Your book ends with the year 1392, when the Koreans were in charge of their own destiny, and for maybe a short time they were united. Then Korea split up and divided again. But that's jumping ahead of the story a little bit. But all right, moving from Korea then to Vietnam. The word Vietnam comes from the earliest inhabitants called the Viets. And if you look on an old map, like when I was a kid, this area of the world was called French Indochina until 1954. Now, granted, in 1956, I would look at maps made in the 1930s and 40s, and this whole area is called French Indochina because the French had it. In 1954, the Vietnamese drove the French out. But anyway, and then they started calling it the land of Vietnam, named after the Viets who were their ancestors. Vietnam, as you may know, is largely a tropical jungle. but they were able to form a state and remain a state for much of their history. They had to struggle against China. When the Chinese came in, the Viets resisted the Chinese and went to the mountains, and the mountains launched guerrilla warfare, but this time it didn't work. The Chinese were just too numerous, and the Viets were too few, and China came in determined to win, and Vietnam had to submit to China, and for 1,000 years, China was to control Vietnam. Now, eventually, the dynasty in China became weak, the Sung dynasty, and the Viets were able to get their independence. At the same time that Tibet got its independence, Tibet is located here, Tibet got in, Korea got their independence, Vietnam got their independence, and eventually the Mongolians came in and conquered the Sung dynasty. But for 1,000 years, Vietnam was under control of China, and that's why Vietnam still has a lot of ties with China. Now, the Chinese, once had conquered, felt it was their duty. I mean, this was the reason people chose to conquer other people. They said to each other, what we must do is civilize these uncivilized people. So they began the process of sinification. In other words, we're going to make these people as civilized as we are. They got them to set up a civil service exam, but unlike the civil service exam in China, in Vietnam, any man could take it. Now, again, folks, one of the things about Vietnam, they did not have a super rich upper class, and didn't have a whole lot we call nobility. A man would become the head of his tribe by just simply being the patriarch of the family, the oldest living member of the family. But he would not develop build a big castle around him and get a bunch of people who work as slaves. So these people, as was true of a lot of tropical peoples, did not develop a super rich group of upper classes. So they were more democratic that way, more egalitarian. Did not develop. I mean, they did set up the civil service exam where every man was allowed to take it. Now, another thing about the process of sinification, in fact, before the Chinese came, Vietnamese couples would decide if they liked each other, well, hey, let's just start living together without the benefit of a ceremony. The Chinese told them, hey, no, this is uncivilized. Before you start living together, you need to have a ceremony. This will give your relationship some kind of legality and give the children born to it a type of legitimacy and just simply make everything about it more legal and more legitimate. They told the Vietnamese couples that they should have a ceremony before they married. Now, again, this is an issue today. And, all right, if I step on anybody's toes, spoke I mean to. You still get more respect if you go for ceremony, but actually get married before you start living together. Okay. Having said that, if anyone wants to speak up, you're welcome to. Otherwise, I'll be quiet. Anyway, the Chinese eventually convinced the Vietnamese to have a ceremony before they just simply started living together. Buddhism came in, as did Confucianism. The Vietnamese did not embrace Confucius like the Koreans. The Vietnamese chose Buddhism over Confucianism. And now, among the Vietnamese primitive ancestors, they had worshipped nature, sometimes called animism, and sometimes called pantheism, two religions that I don't really know there's much difference between. But they were nature worshippers. But, folk, again, nature worship is often associated with primitive peoples who are not highly advanced, along with shamanism, perhaps having witch doctors. So as they civilized, the civilized people would begin to adopt a religion that was more respectable among other civilized folk. These people then tended to adopt Buddhism. Buddhism became the dominant religion of the civilized people throughout much of this region here. The whole part of Southeast Asia that includes Vietnam. Now, But Daoism was also introduced from China, but Daoism did not make a whole lot of headway among the Vietnamese. They preferred Buddhism. Now, once the Viets had driven the Chinese out under the Weak Song dynasty, shortly after the Mongolians took over China, and then the Mongolians said, we're going to reconquer Vietnam. They couldn't. You may know of, I think I already mentioned, the Mongolians would fight from horseback with their swords swishing in the air and fight in squadrons of 10. Try fighting that way in dense jungle and undergrowth. It simply did not work. The Mongolians, so did invade, and initially they engaged the Vietnamese army out in the open field, and the Vietnamese were no match for the Mongols in the open. So the Vietnamese then went to the jungles, and from there they formed guerrilla bands. And the jungle was so thick that in a lot of cases a Vietnamese, I'll call them snipers, nobody that use guns, but a Vietnamese soldier, whatever you call him, guerrilla, could actually hide until the Mongolians were close enough to reach out with a knife and stab the Mongol with a knife and then disappear in the thick jungle without being seen by anybody, including the man he hit. The jungle was that thick. Well, the Mongolians would go through Vietnam, and on their way from one place to another, they would lose just a high percentage of their men, and it was a demoralizing way to fight because you're riding along on your horse or marching along, all of a sudden the buddy beside you drops down. No reason, just he's dead. Well, he was hit by something, of course, that made him. Then you march along a few hundred more feet, the next guy he drops down. After a while, you begin to wonder, which one of us is going to be next? Well, the Mongolians gave up on the Vietnamese and went home. Again, the Chinese could fight them earlier, but the Mongolians, fighting the way they fought, were simply no match for the Vietnamese guerrillas, so they went home. Again, the Vietnamese people learned guerrilla warfare. They were to use it in the 20th century against the French. They drove the French out, so the United States said, we'll step in and we'll keep them going communist. The Vietnamese used guerrilla tactics against the United States and sent the United States home also. I mean, I'm going to say this being American, and some of the people I knew, one of my high school classmates was killed in Vietnam, and some others I knew went to Vietnam. But anyway, this is simply a sad fact of life, that life sometimes deals with those blows. Anyway, they learned guerrilla fighting by initially fighting the Chinese, and then defeating the Mongolians, then the French, and even the United States by this type of fighting. All right. Oh yes, during the long period that Vietnam was under the control of China, there was a woman who led the Vietnamese to try to defeat the Chinese, and back in 2001, I had a female student do a paper on her, when I let you do this, pick your own topics. She could not defeat the Chinese, but she made a valiant attempt. She would operate from a dense jungle, send her troops out to do guerrilla tactics, and have them come home. It just wasn't enough to defeat the Chinese at that time. Now later on, it was. All right. Vietnam and Korea never did adopt the Japanese religion of Shinto. It almost seems like the Japanese Shinto religion was only good for the Japanese people and did not fit in with the lifestyle or the mentality of these people living here. Shinto only for Japanese and for no one else. All right. Having a little bit of time left, we want to spend it in review. Well, there's one more thing I want to say about Japan in the 21st century, and some of you may have heard this already, but I'll say it now anyway because I'm going to be teaching second semester this time. The 21st century Japan, the Japanese people are about to become extinct. Now, back in the 1960s, when everybody in the world was saying birth control, we need to limit our population, the Japanese would go around and they were listened to because, unlike other places, Japan had no religious functions against abortion, against any form of birth control, including what's called infanticide, killing babies after they're born. Well, they kept the population down so well that just last year or so, they said that in the land of Japan, they're selling more diapers for old people than they are for babies. They're not producing babies, and the young Japanese men are noticing that their women care nothing about anything except for career. They're not the least bit interested in marriage, in sex, in babies, or in family life, just career. And the men are wondering, well, what are we going to do? Now, I said this to a class a few years back, and one Japanese girl said, but all the men are interested in is pornography. And then for the whole class, I said back to her, hey, but dying is dying, and death is still dying. And the one I hear, unless you change your ways, you're going to die. I mean, everybody dies. I mean, die without reproducing yourselves. Okay, yeah.
What that girl said is like super duper true. Like the Japanese have like really jacked up their society by trying to emulate a lot of other societies. Like they find the best of
They're copiers. They're not inventors so much.
Yeah, they copy and make it better.
They do copy and make it better. That's the big thing in the 20th century. They did not invent the automobile, but they can make good ones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So by trying to emulate Western culture, like the business thing.
Their animation's good.
Yeah, the anime's dope. Like they totally got the dope man. But
Yeah.
like they through doing that, it's kind of caused everybody to want to have this awesome career, but it's also caused the men to be like really weird sexually, and so there's this issue. Like
Yeah.
what that girl said is really truly real.
I'm aware of that. So anyway,
forced
basically,
down by the Japanese men. Like they aren't about the same things. Like the dudes are trying to, like they just want really weird stuff, and the girls like they're more.
well, basically, unless they change your ways, they're going to die. And also, they do not like foreigners to come in. They keep the land strictly for the Japanese. So they do have about, how many of you have heard of this outside of class? Any of this? I mean, obviously, well, not very many of you. Okay, but in the other class, several persons had. Anyway, all right. Spend about 5 minutes by way of review. Backing up to India. Eventually, the main state religion of India became what? The state religion of India, and has remained so to this day, Hinduism, essentially. Buddhism threatened. Buddhism started out in India, but Hinduism. Now, the religion of some of India's northern neighbors, Pakistan, Nepal, and Bangladesh, is, the religion of these people is Islam. Islam. Islam was never able to conquer all of India. India was quite large, and again, Islamic armies have not done very well engaging people who have a lot of undergrowth and trees and thick brush. Weirdly enough, Islam talks a lot about trees, and yet the places where they live have very few trees. What group of people from Europe wound up coming to India shortly after Columbus came to America? What group was the first people to arrive from Europe by ship? Were the who? Very important, folks, especially if you take second semester world history. Who were the first Europeans to arrive in the Far East by ship? That includes India and other places. The Portuguese. Portugal. Arrived about 1497, and then the Europeans wound up coming in and taking over India and forcing a lot of change. All right, do Muslims eat beef?
Yes.
Yes, they do. Do they eat pork? No. All right, China. Which dynasty united China after it had fallen apart when the Han Dynasty fell? Sui. Then after them came the the greatest dynasty. Except for the Han, the Chinese always look back at this dynasty as being the greatest, except for maybe the Han. Which dynasty was that? The Tang Dynasty. Their greatest dynasty. And then after the Tang Dynasty fell, there came the Sung Dynasty. and it wound up being conquered by the Mongolians who set up another dynasty. Who was the founder of the Mongol Empire? Genghis Khan. All right, but my watch is close.